Alrighty, Math 20-1. So now that we've gone through a few examples of finding the trig ratios of any coordinate point and angle, we are going to quickly chat about the quadrantal angles. So in previous videos, we've talked about how a quadrantal angle is an angle in standard position whose terminal arm lies on the axis. Okay, so you have 4 quadrantal angles. You have one found here, one found here, one found here, and one found here. And so far we have memorized these quadrantal angles. We know this to be 0 degrees, 90 degrees, 180 degrees, 270 degrees, and if you go all the way around from your positive x-axis, so from here all the way around, you get 360 degrees. Now, these quadrantal angles sometimes have very interesting things happen when you try and find the trig ratios because you have zeros popping up. Now, before we jump into this question here, let's recall what you want to recall is that what happens when you divide by 0. So what happens when you divide by 0? Well, you can't divide by 0. So 3 dividing 0, this does not exist. So DNE does not exist. Okay, so you are not allowed to divide by 0. You cannot divide by 0. Okay, and then think about what happens and recall when you divide, think about what happens when you do 0 dividing a number. You are allowed to do this, but any number that gets 0 divided by it equals 0. So 0 dividing 5, that equals 0. 0 dividing 2, that equals 0. 0 divided by square root 3, that equals 0. So these are two things you want to keep in mind when you find the trig ratios. Now for this video, I've gone ahead and taken a screenshot of what your formula sheet, a little part of your formula sheet. So you can notice you have lots of things on your formula sheet that you can use. There is your Pythagoras theorem in terms of x, y, and r, all of your trig ratios in terms of y and x. We'll get into these in the next lessons here. And then you also have your special triangles down here, which is awesome. Okay, so that's going to be really useful moving forward in our learning. Okay, so let's do this question. Determine the values of sine, cos, tan when the terminal arm of a quadrantal angle coincides with the positive y-axis, so when the angle equals 90. So we're just talking about our green terminal arm here. So here's our terminal arm. And we can see, of course, that this creates a 90 degree. So there is our standard angle. Our standard angle equals 90 degrees in this case. Now, this question is asking us for the ratios of that standard angle of 90 degrees. Now recall all of your information here. So your information here tells us the sine, cos, and tan ratios in terms of xr and y. So sine angle equals y over r, cos angle equals x over r, and then tan angle equals y over x. And now at this case, in order to figure out the trig ratios here, we need to determine the y value, the r value, and the x value. So if we go and look at 90 degrees, what do we notice? Well, with our 90 degrees here, we have a coordinate point of 0 and 1. Okay, so in this case, we have 0 and 1 occurring. Now, what the heck does that mean? Well, the most important part is the fact that no matter where you are at 90 degrees, your y value might change, but your x value is always going to be 0. So in this case, your x value equals 0, my y value equals 1, And now you might be asking yourself, what is the r value here? Well, we can still solve for the r value using our nifty equation here. R equals the square root of x squared plus y squared. So r equals the square root of x squared plus y squared. And now it's a matter of plugging it in. So 0 squared plus 1 squared. And we can see here that will become the square root of 1. So it's 1. So r also equals 1. And remember, no matter what quadrant we live in, this is always positive. So now we can go ahead and start plugging our values in. So my sine y over r, well, my y value is 1. So this will be 1 over, and my r value is 1 over 1. So the special thing about our sine 90 equals 1. And if you pull out a calculator here, you can check that. Just make sure you're in degree mode, and if I press sine 90, it gives me 1. So you can see that's where that happens, or that occurs. And that's because y equals r at our 90-degree angle. Now let's see what cos 90 equals, and we can see cos 90 equals 0. So let's check why that is. So in this case, I'm going to start trying to figure out what cos 90 equals. Again, we talked about in this case, our x value here is 0, and our r value is 1. Now recall from what we talked about at the very beginning, any number that's dividing 0 is equal to 0. So this equals 0. So there you go have it. We have proved that cos 90 does in fact equal 0. And you can see, using your calculator here, we were able to see that in our calculator. Now, let's say we were finding the inverse of 0, cos 0. You can see that equals 90 degrees. So remember, the inverse of 0 is finding your angle. And now at this point, let's plug in for tan. So what happens when we plug tan 90 into our calculator here? You can see that I get a calculator error. So let's check why that is. So in this case, tan 90 would equal our y value, which in this case is 1, over our x value, which is 0. And now remember what we mentioned at the very beginning. When you try and divide 0 by numbers, that doesn't exist. You get an error. So at this point, well, it looks like it stole our little portion there. So here, we can see that this does not exist. So now we can kind of generalize this. So sine 90 equals 1. Cos 90 equals 0. And tan 90 equals nothing. It doesn't exist. And I would suggest maybe going through and practicing the other ones here. Remember, it's kind of the same steps, but in this case, if we wanted to focus on cos, let's say cos 180, well, in this case, at 180 degrees, your y value is 0. Your x value is -1, so y is 0, x is -1, and your r value would also be 1, positive 1. If you plug it into your equation here, so -1 squared plus 0 squared, you'll get the square root of positive 1, which is 1. So we can see here, remember that cos angle is x over r. So I could plug in x as -1 over r, which is positive 1. So -1 divided by 1 is -1. So cos 180 here would be -1. Okay, so that was just a little extra to think about. And if we grab out our calculator, if we plug in cos 180, you can see that we get -1. So some pretty neat stuff. It can feel very confusing when you first start learning this. So if you do need some help, please come in and ask. These quadrantal angles will become super crucial when you go to Math 30-1. So let's kind of just clarify everything that we've done here. So let's do all of them, okay? So cos at 0. So whenever you're at a quadrantal angle, you can always make the intercept a 1 or a -1, depending on where you exist. Of course, this has to be -1 for x because it's on the negative x-axis, so on and so forth. So let's talk about cos at 0. So remember, that's 0 degrees. Note, this would also work for 360 degrees because 360 degrees lives in the same spot. So let's go grab our formula sheet. So we have that beside us here. Let's maybe get rid of this here. Okay, so let's look at these questions here and kind of generalize everything that we've learned. So recall, cos is x and r, sine is y and r, and tan is y and x. So when we look at our problem here, let's talk about when the angle is 0 or 360 degrees. So when we're talking about 0 degrees, your x value would equal 1. Your y value equals 0. And your r value, remember, you can always use this to solve it, but it'll always end up kind of being the same thing when you're dealing with quadrantal angles. So if we want to find the r here, it'll be x squared plus y squared. R equals the square root of 1 squared plus 0 squared. And if you solve that, you'll end up getting r equaling 1. So r equals 1 in this case. So now at this point, it's a matter of plugging in. So recall that sine angle in general is y over r, cos angle in general is x over r, and tan angle is y over x. And now it's a matter of plugging our values in. So when we're talking about 0 degrees here, 1 over r, or y over r, that's 0 over 1. So this equals 0. Cos 0 degrees, well, that's x over r, and at 0 degrees my x value is 1, my r value is 1 as well. So this will be 1 over 1, which equals 1. And then tan at 0, that's y over x, so that'll be 0 over 1, which ends up giving us 0. So you can see here, sine at 0 would equal 0, cos at 0 equals 1, tan at 0 equals 0. And again, you can check all of these with the calculator. So sine 0 is 0. Cos 0 is positive 1. Tan 0 is 0. So we can see all of these are true. Now let's talk about our 180 degrees. So if we look at 180 degrees, that's found right here. My x value is -1, my y value is 0. So at 180 degrees, you have your x value equaling -1, your y value equals 0. And remember, if you needed to, you could use your formula here. But what you'll end up getting is that r equals 1 in this case. R does not always equal 1. I want to make that clear. But when you're dealing with like 1 and 0, and you plug it in, it will equal 1 in this case. And now it's a matter of plugging in. So let's figure out what sine 180 is. Sine 180. Well, at 180, we just talked about our y value being 0 and our r value being 1. So this would be 0 over 1, so that equals 0. Then we'll have our cos 180. And we did prove this one on the last page, but remember cos is x over r, so it'll be -1 over 1. So -1 over 1, which equals -1. And then tan 180. Tan is y over x, so that will be 0 over -1, which equals 0. So I'm saying that tan 180 equals 0. So let's maybe check that, just see if that's true. So tan 180 we can see is 0 there. Finally, let's look at our 270 degree angle. So at 270 degrees, let's talk about the values. So here we have 270 degrees, we have x and we have y. And we can see that x is 0, y is -1. So x equals 0, y is -1. And what would r be here? Well, you guessed it, we could use our equation. So 0 squared plus -1 squared. That will give us the square root of +1. So r gives us 1, because r is always positive. And now it's a matter of plugging in our values. So sine at 270, well, first of all, sine is y over r, and at 270, -1 and 1. So this will be -1 over 1, which equals -1. Let's do cos here. So cos 270. And remember what cos is. Cos is x over r. My value of x is 0. My r value is 1, so it'll be 0 over 1, which equals 0. And then last but not least, tan 270. Tan is what again? Tan is y over x. My y value is -1. My x value is 0. Now remember, we cannot divide by 0. So that means tan 270 does not exist. So that can't work. And let's check that. Let's throw tan 270 into our calculator here. So tan 270 gives us a calculator error, which we said would occur. Let's see what cos 270 should equal. So I'm going to just change this to cos 270, and you can see that equals 0 here. And that's what we said cos 270 would equal. How about if we take the inverse of cos and put 0 inside? Remember, when you put the inverse of something, you're finding the angle. And you can see here that this gives us 90 degrees. So that's why your calculator is not as smart as you, because cos equals 0 in two different places. It equals it at 90 degree here. You can see that cos 90 equals 0, but so does cos 270, and your calculator won't show you that solution. So that's something to be aware of, and that's why your calculator is not reliable in this unit. So if you have any questions, please come ask some questions. I would suggest practicing a few problems before moving forward. And the next few videos here, we are going to go over determining exact values of things. And we will be using our friendly reminder of our special triangles here. So have your data sheet ready for the next video, go practice some problems, and ask any questions if you have them so far. Other than that, have a good day.